Stewardship. Her Kirkwood Lab of Ontario Tech has many graduate students doing amazing work in environmental biology. She has done studies at a number of wetlands around Southern Ontario, including our very own Duffins Creek wetlands. So thank you for doing our meeting for us, Andrea. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I have been having some spotty internet all day. So what I'm going to do, if it's okay, just for my presentation, I'm going to share my slides shortly, but I'm going to stop my video just to kind of improve the bandwidth that I have. So just one moment.
So Steve, you may need to stop sharing at your end so that Andrea can take control of the bridge.
Okay, so I cannot see you anymore, but I can hear you. So let me know if you can't see my screen that I'm sharing. So my talk tonight is going to be on the value of urban wetlands. And I was contacted by Carolyn basically because of what was happening in the news and on the ground with some activism work. I was more or less behind the scenes. I certainly applaud all of the local community activists that were really integral into protecting part of the Duffins Creek wetland complex. And so I thought I'd use this opportunity, assuming that most of you are naturalists, so you are naturally curious about the natural world and like to understand it, and that's basically why I became a biologist. I was a budding naturalist as a child. And so I'm going to start off my talk focusing on what wetlands are, kind of have my professor hat on for a little bit, and then I'll shift gears into focusing a little bit more on Duffins Creek wetland complex. So before I get into my talk, I would first like to acknowledge the lands and people of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation. I'm thankful to be welcomed on these lands in friendship. The lands I am situated on are covered under the Williams Treaties and are the traditional territory of the Mississauga, a branch of the Great Anishinaabe Nation, including Algonquin, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. These lands remain home to a number of Indigenous nations and people who have cared for Turtle Island, also known as North America, from before the arrival of settler peoples. Most importantly, I remember the history of poor treatment and a lack of friendship with Indigenous peoples, and this history is something we are all affected by as treaty people. Our past defines our present, but if we move forward as friends and allies, then it does not have to define our future. So the first thing I want to talk about is really defining what a wetland is. And I'm sure most of you as naturalists know what a wetland is, but really a wetland is this really interesting ecosystem that serves as a transition zone between dry lands and, completely submerged lands known as ponds and lakes. And so wetlands are areas where soils are water saturated for a sufficient length of time. So it's not just a matter of, being covered, say there was a heavy rainfall and there was some water that, ponded on the landscape and then it's gone in a matter of days. That's just not sufficient to saturate the soils and create a unique geochemistry in the soils to really support wetland plants and the type of wetland, which I'll talk about shortly. So a wetland can also be defined as a transition zone between uplands and permanently flooded lowlands. And so this is a picture, I believe, of Bowmanville Marsh, taken by probably Heather Pankhurst, who's the wetland biologist with CLOCA. Okay, so this is a list of wetland types that I show my students in my aquatic ecology course. And you can see that in Canada, we have 5 main types of wetlands. So you've probably heard of a marsh. And of course, I'll be talking more about marshes in tonight's talk. But there's also swamps, bogs, fens, and shallow open water. Up in the boreal forest, bogs and fens are fairly common, as well as certain types of swamps. But for the most part, in southern Ontario, we have coastal wetlands that are kind of shallow open water systems, as well as typically marshes with, cattails as the dominant plant type. And so here you can see a photo of, bogs. Again, that probably looks like black spruce there, kind of mixed woody species with more kind of, annual and herbaceous shrubs. And then down to, marshes where you see there's some open water as well as emergence like cattails, and then shallow open water systems. So there's, in Second Marsh and Duffins Creek wetland marsh down the coastal wetland area, you will see more of this open water, like it has more of the features of a shallow lake. Now, I really like this figure from Ketty in 2000, which is really helps to define wetland type because, of course, water is involved, saturation, so the wetland has to be soggy for a certain period of time and a certain depth of flooding. So when you have an axis of duration, so the time of flooding, and so short duration here, longer duration up here, and the bottom here now we have another axis of depth of flooding, so shallow to deep. And you can see that at least 4 of those wetland types I talked about really parse out based on these conditions. So relatively short flooding period, but deeper waters. And so that tends to be swamps. I'm sure some of you are familiar with maple swamps that we have in southern Ontario that really are only wet like this in the springtime. And then marshes, they kind of are right in the middle where they can tolerate a dynamic change in depth from shallow to deeper over the ice-free season. But then peatlands up here and even open water wetlands, they generally have longer periods of water that's persistent all the time. Whereas in marshes, you can have water level change so dramatically from centimeters to, over a meter. And the same with the swamp. But a swamp tends to have periods of drying out more so than a marsh. So wetlands, another kind of defining characteristic of them as important ecosystems from a human perspective is that they slow the flow of water. And that includes both surface waters, so when it rains and the snow melt, as well as groundwater flow, which of course is slower, but there's connectivity between wetlands and groundwater in the water table as well. So wetlands have extremely high value because they do mitigate floodwaters. So when you have, periods where there's lots of snow melt, heavy rains, you could just see that when the water would run into a wetland, it would fan out. The vegetation would absorb some of that water and slow it down and allow it to infiltrate. And so this is an interesting constructed wetland in Ann Arbor, so just south of the border in Michigan, where they, engineers basically copied a natural wetland because, of course, in this area, probably the original wetlands were infilled, 100 to 150 years ago. And now there's efforts being made to reconstruct these wetlands because of the function, the really important function that they offer. They also offer, so they, you can think of wetlands as being important in when there's too much water and important when there's not enough water. And so because they slow the flow of water and they can store water, during periods of drought, wetlands can allow a slow trickle of what we call base flow water into streams when it hasn't rained for a while. And so sometimes in the summer, even in our tributaries in southern Ontario, base flow can come from groundwater, which is also, groundwater and wetlands are connected. And so some of that water is being sourced from wetlands. Now, I kind of went back and forth about including this graph because I realize now, this chart, or cartoon rendering of a cross-section of a wetland complex. But I couldn't find a better picture on the internet, and I didn't have time to make one myself. So this says regional flow. I don't really want you to really pay too much attention to the text. This is a stream. what I do want you to focus on, because it is important, because it's really a key characteristic of the Duffins Creek Wetland Complex, where you have these little wetlands that are part of the complex that are higher up in the watershed. And you can see that when water flows, because water flows down, water gets slowed down and absorbed in each of these wetlands. And so by the time it infiltrates and goes into the groundwater and eventually makes its way to a stream, or think of Lake Ontario in this situation, it's a much cleaner, and it allows for basically biofiltration and flood control. So in that sense, it's kind of doing two jobs there. So wetlands overall, just staying within the theme of just wetlands, regardless of type, they're all threatened. And in fact, wetlands are some of the most threatened ecosystems in the world. And so here is just a map showing where you have, high concentrations of wetlands. And so not surprisingly, Canada and the boreal forest has lots of surface water. And of course, that's left, basically the last glaciation scraped off of a lot of the topsoil and exposed a lot of the bedrock underneath. And so there's lots of depressions that were left behind. And so water accumulated and then infilled with plants and so forth. So we have a very rich wetland, abundance of wetlands in the world. And so far, the boreal forest is largely intact, although it is threatened by mineral excavation and exploration, and also just with climate change as well. But for much of the world, wetlands have been infilled and converted to agriculture. And as human populations expand, wetlands that are kind of, or at least human population centers that infringe on wetlands tend to cause wetland degradation. A lot of the times, just think of the Netherlands, hydrologic modification. So dehydration is just really the fancy way of saying diverting water away so that water is no longer flowing into the wetland. And inundation as well, it involves just infilling and sometimes in some respects, inundation can be flooding out and turning it into a lake as opposed to a wetland. Maintaining a wetland. Fragmentation loss is a huge problem in southern Ontario. So here you can see in North America from pre-1954, the estimated net annual conversion rate, so turning wetlands into land use, whether it be agriculture or urban land use. And you can see that, at first glance you think, oh, well, it's declining as you get to, the late 90s. But what this is actually reflecting is that there's fewer and fewer wetlands to convert as you, proceed through time. And so this is very much true for southern Ontario, where we know that, it's been estimated about 75% of wetlands have been destroyed or just basically infilled and converted. And in the GTA, we know that about 90% of wetlands have been converted or destroyed. So certainly wetlands are very vulnerable to human impacts. Now, when it comes to the wetlands that remain and that aren't destroyed, they are certainly vulnerable to pollution. So when you think about even in just where we live in Durham region, for example, we know that up towards the headwaters of many of the tributaries of Duffins Creek, Lind Creek, Oshawa Creek, there's agriculture. And so nutrients, fertilizer is applied. But now my lab is actually showing that people living in urban areas applying fertilizer to their gardens. It's even pet poo and waste has been, there's an American study showed that it's a fairly significant source of nitrogen and phosphorus. So nutrients are being sourced by people in various ways. Contaminants, you think of pesticides, herbicides, and certainly road salt is impacting. And it's interesting that I'm seeing that in the news more recently because of a U of T study, but of course, the Toronto Region Conservation Authority 20 years ago was publishing reports showing how road salt application and our freshwater waterways were becoming saltier. So vegetation removal, invasive species, non-indigenous, so such as Phragmites is a popular one. Purple loosestrife, interestingly enough, was very much a problematic invasive species, originally from Eurasia, with the introduction of a beetle that they use it as what they call biocontrol to really eat the plant and help native species compete with it, proved to be successful. And there's other reasons why purple loosestrife kind of died back for a bit, but it is starting to pop up again, which is interesting from an ecological perspective. So mosquito control, this probably can be included with pesticides, but with West Nile virus, there are programs by the Public Health Department to put pesticides in our waterways, and of course these kill native insects that birds depend on and other organisms depend on for their food. Okay, so there's wetlands in a world round, a very short and in a nutshell, summary of what wetlands are. And I'm going to now zoom into marshes, and because this is really quite relevant to the coastal marshes that we live nearby in Durham region. And so marshes are characterized by emergent, soft-stemmed vegetation, so you don't see any trees here. Cattails, reeds, bulrushes, those tend to be the dominant types of soft-stemmed vegetation. Of course, they're perennial because they do die back, and their tubers store starch and allow them to survive and overwinter to have energy to sprout up again when temperatures warm up and the sun's shining again in spring and summer. Now, with marshes, compared to, say, other wetlands like, bogs and fens, which tend to have fairly stable water levels over time, marshes are very dynamic. And so this is known as being hydrodynamic. So water levels in marshes can go down really from a few centimeters to well over a meter deep. Within if there's a big storm surge, they could be within hours. But generally speaking, over the course of the growing season, these plants and animals have to adapt to changing water levels. And certainly in the Great Lakes, this has become more and more of an issue. And of course, there's a beaver that loves wetlands. So freshwater marshes are one of the most productive ecosystems on Earth. When we think about saltwater marshes, they're very productive. We know that. But there's been studies now to show that, acre per acre, in comparison, freshwater marshes are just as productive. And so this is a photo taken by Lois Gillette. I used to sit on the Second Marsh board with her several years ago, and I just think this is a wonderful picture showing the productivity. And so when we talk about productivity, it's really talking about the primary producers, so the plants and algae. They're the organisms that are bringing in energy into the system, and they help sustain the entire food web as the energy flows up into the insects and into the fish and the birds. And even people that fish in these systems, and presumably eat the fish if they're safe to eat. So coastal marshes are quite prevalent in most of the Great Lakes, particularly Lake Michigan and Lake Huron here, and even in Lake Ontario. Farther to the east and in and around Kingston, there's many coastal marshes. Varying from, barrier beach types, so think of Frenchman's Bay, McLaughlin Bay, to drowned river mouth marshes, which is what Duffin's Creek Marsh is, technically a drowned river mouth marsh. And so, but when you look at where we are, there aren't, coastal wetlands are not that prevalent. And so I would argue there's even more of a reason why we should really be protecting these ecosystems, because they're not that common in our neck of the woods. So even though I consider myself more of an ecologist that focuses on the little things that are what we call are not charismatic megafauna, that I think naturalists like the birds and the turtles and things that you can really see and that are cute. I tend to focus on the algae and the bacteria and the bugs and the plants. But I thought it'd be important to still talk about biodiversity because of the high productivity in coastal marshes. Not surprisingly, these marshes support a wide variety of wildlife. And I like this schematic here because it gives you a sense of, well, why are there so many different types of organisms in wetlands? And it's largely because, oh, I see Lois. I'm just going to let her in there. You have this transitional ecosystem that has upland forest habitat, shrub habitat. Now we're getting into wet meadow. You know, as you go down, it gets wetter and wetter. Now we're getting into more of the marsh and then the open water. So there's habitat for birds that prefer upland habitat, birds that prefer, getting more into the shrubs and the wet meadows. And so you, if you're familiar with the terminology of ecological niches, there's just more diversity of habitat and niche space to support a larger variety. So you may not have, the abundance or biomass of the organisms may not be, that high, but the diversity can be high because there's different types of habitats to support different types of organisms. And so when I tried to find, because personally I don't, I just assumed that, the conservation authorities and maybe some, Ontario Nature, or there's, a repository of all the wildlife in Duffins Creek coastal marsh. And it was difficult to find, difficult to hunt down. So Twitter proved to be quite a resource because people would, in fact, post pictures of, there's a site in Duffins Creek Marsh where, they have an interpretive area where you can look out into the marsh and see if you can find some of the organisms that are and the wildlife that are in these permanent structures, educational structures. And then the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation, they became really active on Twitter when Duffins Creek Wetland Complex was under threat to be converted. At least part of it in the upper part of the complex was being, threatened with being turned into a warehouse. And so they started a campaign of really highlighting the biodiversity. And so they just listed off a bunch of different, bird species. Looks like most of them are, raptor species that have been found in and around Duffins Creek wetland. And then they thought they'd start going into the aquatic plants and diversity, because of course aquatic plants are not only important in and of themselves, but aquatic vegetation provides very important habitat for fish and invertebrates. Birds, the red-headed woodpecker, I'd love to see one of these in the wild. I've never seen one. And of course winterberry, which is really important as food for pollinators, and the berries themselves would be important for birds and snakes. So just they covered the whole gamut of the types of organisms and wildlife that you can find in and around Duffins Creek coastal marsh. So that leads me to this op-ed that my colleagues, Rebecca Rooney is a professor at University of Waterloo, and so is Nandita Basu, who's also a professor. Nandita is an environmental engineer and who, focuses on eco-hydrology of wetlands. And Rebecca is, her and I actually do fairly similar research in wetlands, whereas Rebecca probably does a little bit more with organisms like frogs and birds. But we were very disturbed when we found out that part of the coastal wetland complex, which this is a photo, and it's very nondescript. For any of you who maybe attended some of the protests that happened, it's in a very industrialized area. basically you see phragmites and probably some garbage, and you wouldn't really know it was a wetland perhaps. And yet urban wetlands are exceedingly rare in southern Ontario. And as I've mentioned, 90% of wetlands have been infilled and destroyed in the GTA alone. Wetlands are highly fragmented, and I'll show you a photo shortly where you can see that once obviously connected wetlands, and that's why it's called a wetland complex, are fragmented by urbanization largely, but they can be fragmented by agricultural activities as well. But you have this part of the wetland complex that doesn't really look like a wetland. It's full of invasive species. It's likely contaminated because it's just south of the 401, which highways like the 401 are notorious for emissions that get deposited nearby. So just particulate matter, urban pollution is typically from cars is copper and lead, and there's salt runoff. So really, no one's going to say this is a pristine wetland. Is what I'm getting at. And yet, why do we care about it? So here's the picture of the coastal wetland complex. So when we think of Duffins Creek wetland, most of us think about the coastal marsh with these kind of natural cells that have formed. It's a drowned river mouth, but really, and this goes back to that horrible graphic I showed you earlier where you saw the cross-section of the wetlands, as water flows down in, because this is a higher elevation, right? This is the low elevation as it reaches Lake Ontario. So water is flowing through, this is part of the Duffins Creek watershed. And so you can see that really the remnant parts of the wetlands, they're fragmented, but underneath in the groundwater, they are still connected. And so this is the part that was really that was going to be converted. And you can see that if it, 54 or 57 hectares, I believe was the total number, if that was destroyed, then that would have major repercussions for the water quality down in this part where all the wildlife that people love exists. And so this is hopefully the take-home point. One of the take-home points from this talk will be that when we think about wetlands, it shouldn't just be about the pretty birds and turtles and so forth. But if we want that wildlife to thrive down here, we have to protect what's running into it upstream. And these remnant parts of the coastal wetland complex are really important in slowing that water down and trapping the particulates and contaminants. And so, as I mentioned, this coastal wetland complex, which is down here, is part of a much larger watershed. And this is known as the Duffins Creek watershed. And the Toronto Region and Conservation Authority, their last report for the watershed was done in 2018, and they base it on a number of different water quality parameters. And so overall for surface water, based on nutrients and temperature, etc. Excuse me, I'm just going to take some water here. Talking about water, now I need to drink some water. It was rated an overall C. Which is probably nothing to brag about. It's not as bad, certainly, as other watersheds in Toronto. But what is something that is worth noting, and it's important with respect to conservation and protection, is that 42% of the entire watershed is still protected. Or sorry, not protected, is natural. And it should be protected, but of course we know that large developments are still going in up near the headwaters in the Seton development, for example. Although I have heard the Seton development, they're trying to incorporate low-impact design into some of the development. But even so, development is development, and it's going to have a negative impact because, of course, natural land cover is going to absorb heavy rains, and there's going to be wetlands that are interspersed in this natural cover as well. Okay, so urban development does continue to grow, as we know, in Durham Region. And part of that development was, again, going to be resulting in the destruction of part of the lower Duffins Creek wetland complex, which was fortunately saved at the 11th hour. Now, this is a GIF or GIF, depending on how you pronounce it. I used to say GIF, and then I've heard people say GIF, but it's an animation of the, so here's Frenchman's Bay down here, and it's from 1984 to 2020. And so you can see this is 1984, and we're going out into the 90s. What I think it does a great job of, and of course it's using artificial color to highlight the change, but as you see this kind of purpley color, that's urban development. The light green is plants of some sort. It can be agriculture as well. Darker green is usually more natural areas, forested areas, and you can see certainly the ravines and tributaries, riparian zones of kind of the larger. This is probably, I think, the Rouge, and Duffins Creek. But I wanted to show it to you because it really drives home how much change there has been, and we cannot expect water quality in our coastal wetlands to remain high when we continue with this type of development. Because if you recall that, again, that graphic, if you were to take away all of the upstream wetlands and turn them into parking lots, the water has nowhere to go. And so the water will just flow really quickly with all the dirt and grime from urban activities, and that could only result in degradation of our coastal wetlands. And so urban wetlands, up to this point, I've pretty much painted a sad tale where we've lost most of them, and what remains are really contaminated, full of invasive species. So why should we really care about them? Well, we should care about them because they're so rare now, and yet they still are so important to us and the organisms that live in them. So I really like this. So worldwetlandday.org is a website, but it's also an organization that celebrates World Wetland Day. I believe it's February 2nd every year, because they know that wetlands have, much of the wetlands around the world, especially in urban areas, have been destroyed. And so there's a real push now to protect the ones we have, as well as restore highly degraded ones and even build new ones. And in Europe, that's exactly what they're doing more and more. They're constructing wetlands. But here is just a nice summary of, why should we prize urban wetlands? Well, I've talked to you about how they control flooding, and they do filter waste from water, but they also improve air quality. And that's because when you have vegetation like you find in wetlands, they can actually take up what we call volatile organic compounds. They could trap particulates. So, and then when it rains, that removes dirt from the air and it gets trapped in wetlands. A source of drinking water, if you live in Pickering or Ajax or Whitby, Oshawa, you're getting your water from Lake Ontario. And so water that comes off of the land flows through wetlands and makes its way into Lake Ontario, which is our drinking water. Wetlands certainly promote human well-being. People who live near nature, and I think I'm preaching to the choir here, are going to benefit from just looking at the wildlife, walking along a boardwalk. We're seeing that that's being recognized more and more as being essential to quality of life in cities. And, a source of livelihoods, maybe, for conservation biologists. But overall, I think this is really just getting at, being a source of, a resource, food, fish, plants, etc., that can be sourced from wetlands, but not so true, I would say, probably in the Greater Toronto area. Okay, so as cities are growing, wetlands are declining, and we need to stop this trend. Okay, so here's another infographic that, again, does a really good job of visualizing why urban wetlands make cities livable. Okay, so this is really getting at the heart of the title of my talk. Why should we value urban wetlands? And so I have already mentioned about storage and filtration and controlling flooding, but really the livable aspect is it's these green spaces for recreation and outdoor activities that I think because it's hard to put a dollar value. And in fact, it's hard to put a dollar value in all of these, although environmental economists do try. They try to evaluate all of these, what we call ecosystem services, even things like carbon storage, which we know wetlands are very effective at storing carbon. But it's this green space aspect that we're seeing more and more, that nature, being close to nature, and this diversity of nature that's supported by wetlands is really beneficial to people living in the concrete jungle of cities. Okay, so as water moves slowly through a wetland, contaminants are filtered out. And so this is really, the crux of when we talk about this biofiltration from wetlands. Not only are the particulates kind of buried, but there's microbes. And this is basically, I'm doing a plug for the type of research we do in my lab. Early on, when I was starting my research group, we were studying urban wetlands because we wanted to know, they seem to be, low diversity, they're degraded, they have invasive species, but what about their function? Do they still function the way we think wetlands function, and we know wetlands function through biofiltration? And so this is my first graduate student, Nicholas Gilbert, who sampled from different wetland types in and around Oshawa and Whitby. This wetland that he's sampling in actually, it just looks like a typical cattail-dominated, marshy wetland near an old dump in Oshawa that had been receiving leachate from that dump for 50 years. And so we consider this the contaminated wetland, historically contaminated wetland. Then he sampled from a constructed remnant wetland. So, constructed wetland, not remnant, which it was in Oshawa. And then a remnant wetland in Whitby, where just housing developments just built up around it. And fortunately, it was part of a conservation lands that are the headwaters of Pringle Creek. And so it was allowed to be, just basically it was regarded as, a flood plain. And so when he compared the biodegradation potential, so when you think about the different pesticides that get applied, and I know in Ontario there's a pesticide ban, but people still use herbicides such as 2,4-D. So 2,4-D, I guess I cut off the title here, but 2,4-D is a herbicide that it's used for killing weeds in lawns. And so he looked at the degradation, because it's an organic compound, and bacteria are amazing. They have enzymes that can break down most organic compounds. He looked at the removal efficiency. And all I really want you to get from this graph is that just over a 21-day experiment, he was able to show that the remnant wetland had the highest rate of removal. So really, a wetland that was still had its, more or less the remnant community before it became fragmented by urbanization, it still is functioning. It still had this capacity, and that's good for us because we don't want to drink, herbicides and pesticides in our water. If we can let the microbes break it down for us, that's going to actually clean the water. And so this is just an example of the value of an urban wetland. And in this case, it was a remnant urban wetland that proved to function the best. And so really, how do we protect urban wetlands? Because we should value them. And part of this is really, let's just stop destroying them and start restoring wetlands. And so even though I've tried to convince you that even the degraded ones are worth saving, I think then the next step is, well, let's try and restore them. And because by doing that, you're actually improving habitat quality for wildlife as well, not just the function that they serve, like say for flood mitigation and carbon sequestration. Don't dam rivers or over-extract from aquifers because, of course, wetlands depend on these sources of water to maintain their wetness. And also address pollution, stop putting so much road salt, using so much road salt, let's clean up these freshwater sources that end up, flowing into wetlands. Like wetlands are good at cleaning up some of this dirty water, but it'd make the work a lot easier if we didn't dirty it to begin with. ourselves, if we, and this is probably more for those people who depend on groundwater, but if we can at least be more water efficient, we're not depleting the groundwater supplies that also support urban wetlands. And then finally, and this is a big, an important point because it does relate to the issue that we had with the Duffins Creek Wetland Complex when the province was kind of retroactively changing the provincial policy statement that protects provincially significant wetlands. We have to do, I guess, a better job of integrating the protections and restoration of wetlands into our development plans and resource management policies. So I wanted to end on a positive note. The Toronto Region Conservation Authority, you probably, if you're following the news, you saw that they were kind of in the thick of it because the laws were changed and their kind of role in permitting was changed in protecting wetlands. But an important job of conservation authorities is stewardship. And when they have the capacity to do restoration projects, they really target those parts of our landscape that really need help. And so Duffins Creek wetland, right down where it meets Lake Ontario, early on, so in the early 2000s, it was noted that these natural cells, so in a drowned river mouth marsh, you do get these kind of natural, what we call cells of just kind of pond-like areas in the wetland complex. You get the channel, there's channelization. This is all natural as it kind of flows into Lake Ontario. And it was, they determined that carp and just other kind of issues, really mostly urban runoff that caused turbidity because of erosion. But carp, perhaps you've seen carp in the wetlands, they're very active and they are bottom feeders. And when they spawn, they can be quite physically active. And so they are known for causing what we call bioturbation. So they stir up the sediments and they maintain high turbidity. So also
I would love to hear the completion of Andrea's comments there, Dan, if that's possible.
Mm-hmm.
It was hard to hear what you said.
I'm sorry. I would like to hear the balance of Andrea's comments before we got cut off, because it was getting very, very interesting, very coming to a conclusion there, I thought.
Andrea, I don't know if you were able to hear Peter's question. Are you online?
Oh dear.
We'll just give her a second. She shows it's still connected, but I'm not sure she's.
So I am back. It's very annoying. I don't know why it keeps, it's like it's very unstable, but I'm sorry about that. I am back now.
Peter, do you want to repeat your question for her?
And Dr. Kirkwood, I was interested in your comments before you got cut off. You were on a bit of a roll there, and I just wanted to hear you tie the whole thing together. If you can go back and just recoup that, I'd appreciate it.
Oh, so the corner marsh?
Yes, just the tail end. You're about halfway through, I thought, your presentation there.
Okay. So yeah, I guess actually I just assumed because I probably I continued to talk without realizing at that point that I was booted out. But I wanted to end on a high note that corner marsh is kind of a good news story where when you restore wetlands by, for example, excluding invasive species like carp and just helping restore the natural kind of hydrology of the marsh. So Corner Marsh is part of the Lower Duffins Creek Wetland Complex. It's now infilled with native aquatic plants, and the water quality has greatly improved, so you don't have all that turbidity in that cell. My lab is actually working with TRCA right now, studying long-term trends in the water quality of this marsh. So, we're still kind of looking at the data, but overall water quality has improved in that cell. And then my last slide was just questions, asking for questions.
Thank you. How did you keep the carp out, or how are you keeping the carp out of the marsh now?
Well, so TRCA put in a fish passage, and I think they've done something similar like this in Coots Paradise Marsh in Hamilton. And so really it's just like a gate that is designed to really exclude fish by size. So it's not like looking at, oh, you're a carp, I'll exclude you. It's really, and of course, if there's small carp, they're going to be getting in. But really, it's the large carp that cause the problems with bioturbation and turbidities. And then also their behavior and even foraging behavior doesn't allow aquatic plants to establish as well. And so the aquatic plants are really important in kind of trapping and settling out a lot of that turbidity. So but I'm sure, Ducks Unlimited, TRCA, there's folks there that have actually constructed these gates, would be able to give you more information.
Thanks.
Have you had anything to do with the Bowmanville fish stock there? Is that working well or not?
Yeah, no, I had
Sorry,
nothing
not Bowmanville, I mean Hampton.
Oh, Coots Paradise?
I don't know if it's called Coots Paradise, but it's in Hampton and they've got a fish stop there.
Yeah, well, I stocked or stopped?
Stop, a fish
Okay.
stop.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that at all. As I say, I'm not a fish biologist. I don't do too much work with fish. I study fish habitat, but I'm only familiar with what they called a carp barrier at Coots Paradise Marsh, where they had it more or less I don't know if it was a gate. I think it was a different kind of style than the one in Duffins, but I'm not even sure if it was even that effective. But unfortunately, I don't know a lot about that particular one that you're talking about.
Okay.
Dr. Kirkwood, there's a couple of questions in the chat box. One of them from Ellen and another one from Steve. I don't know if you can open up the chat on your side.
Yep. So the first one from Ellen, but my grad students finding that the remnant wetland was most effective in degrading pollutants. Is that finding supported widely? Are old and established wetlands more active ecologically than recent constructed wetlands? Yeah, so I don't know about if it's a generalization, but absolutely we know that, which is kind of surprising, and we're still trying to kind of figure it out why, but and it may have to do with just natural ecosystems have had a much longer time for organisms to evolve and, develop their kind of community structure, what we call consortia, so consortia of microorganisms. And they just seem to have this capacity to degrade, and this has even been found in forest soils, to degrade, what we call xenobiotic compounds. So humans have created these, pesticides, they designed them, but because they're organic in nature, it's just amazing that when you have a lot of microbial diversity, you increase your chances that there's going to be enzymes being produced in that community that can attack those compounds and break them down. So I would say yes, that there is generally, it's not unusual to find similar results to what we found. And so the next question, pardon me, is I visited a wetland at a stormwater retention pond. So that's up my alley because we also study stormwater ponds in my lab. A small scale constructed wetland in Whitby the day I got my, COVID vaccination. It had a pair of ring-necked ducks, pied-billed grebe, and lots of nature. So this is actually a really interesting point. There is a paper, a report from the town of Aurora studied stormwater ponds and was very concerned that people were treating or viewing stormwater ponds as habitat. And in fact, they are habitat, but stormwater ponds are contaminated. And so there's concern that, if there's contaminants like metals and they concentrate in these ponds, is that going to be harmful to wildlife? And so the jury's still out on that because really a lot of the contaminants in stormwater ponds are in the sediment. So if the wildlife is not rooting around the sediment, then there's probably not going to be an impact on the wildlife. But there is a big debate going on about stormwater ponds serving as habitat as opposed to making the effort of restoring and even creating constructed wetlands that are much more amenable to supporting wildlife. So that's an interesting point. Definitely you saw quite a bit of bird diversity there. I've never seen that much diversity. I only see Canada geese at stormwater ponds or red-winged blackbirds, but so that's really interesting. And then this question here, do you know whether the replacement of cattails by Phragmites in a wetland causes changes in the microorganisms? Oh, that's a really good question. And my colleague, Rebecca Rooney, has a PhD student who studies Phragmites. And I think they're looking at this a little bit in the sense of they want to control Phragmites with glyphosate, which is a type of pesticide or herbicide, I should say. And I think the microorganisms but I think that's related to the glyphosate as opposed to the Phragmites. But I would hypothesize that you would have differences in the microbiome that's associated with cattails versus Phragmites. And so that's an interesting question that's worthy of research. So the stormwater ponds locally won't have lead shot from hunters, though. That's true. Very true. But it is an interesting, I am interested in the question of, and I'm very concerned because stormwater ponds on the one hand are better than nothing, but, the Duffins Creek wetland complex portion that was going to be destroyed for a warehouse, they were going to have to build stormwater ponds. And stormwater ponds do not replace wetlands. So that we know for sure.
About